So you should only test one thing, but what exactly is one thing? That's an important question. And you can definitely have a theoretic discussion about this with abstraction levels and so on. And if you're interested in that, I got a whole course about writing clean code where I also talk about functions that should only do one thing, where I dive into that entire concept in a bit greater detail. This is definitely a course I recommend, but you don't need to take it to proceed here. Because in the scope and in the context of texting, for me, one thing basically just means one feature or one behavior that I want to test per test. For example, I want to test validating input value or transforming it. I don't want to do both things together in one test. But even when it comes to validation, I might want to validate a string for being empty and for having enough characters in different tests. So I typically try to be as granular as possible and have one feature or behavior per test. That's simply what I try to follow, and that's the simple rule I can give you when it comes to testing one thing. Again, here at the example what we saw before in the previous course section for the math.js file, I am testing for the sum of these numbers in one test, and then I am testing for the behavior related to an empty array in another test. Even though technically here I'm also building the sum of numbers, since there are no numbers, it just turns out to be 0. But for me, it makes sense to split those tests. Of course, you could definitely also argue in the opposite direction and merge those tests. As always in programming, there rarely is a clear wrong or right, but typically, as mentioned, you should try to keep your tests focused and concise and have multiple tests instead of one big test.